but word started to get around town, so over 2,000 people in this mob took him out of police custody, took him to the Bluff Street Bridge, hung him, and shot him in the throat, and just left him there to rot. The racial terror component, at the risk of, not getting too graphic, but lynchings were surrounded by kind of this carnival atmosphere. I mean, people would bring their children. They would cut off the appendages of the victim. They would take photographs and trade. They would make postcards and trade them like states where lynching, surrounded by where there were high numbers of lynching, you'll see that there's still like a high number of black men incarcerated, a high number of black men on death row in those particular counties and states. And so you kind of can draw a straight line from that to what we see happening today. So I've been doing that for a while. On top of that, thinking about this history of lynching, I came across this incredible painting that is being projected, and it's at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. It's in the Modern Art section on the second floor. And when I first saw the painting, I didn't see the title of it, but you can just see this black woman who is obviously distraught, this baby who's crying and maybe even holding up the Black Power sign, but you know something bad has happened. The title of the painting lets us know. It's called Lynch Family. It was done by a Jewish painter named Joseph Hirsch back in 1946. And there were a particularly high number of lynchings that took place in 1945 and 1946. And Joseph Hirsch was sensitive to that and wanted to use his art to speak to it. And I think just this is very quiet but powerful way to address the horror of lynching. And I wanted to write a poem in response to it. Over the years, I've gotten really attracted and drawn to writing ekphrastic poems, which are poems that are written in response to a piece of visual art or a photograph or some visual image. And so I just kept looking at this painting, and the blue background, when you see it in person, is just very rich. And it kind of hit me what I should write. And so the next poem I would like to share with you is called Lynch Family Blues. Went out swinging last night, baby. Hope you didn't wait up for me. Said I was swinging all night, baby. Did you stay up late for me? I wasn't swinging in no joint, darling. I was out on the limb of a tree. Now I'm walking on air, baby. Feels almost like I'm free. My feet steady kicking the wind. Yeah, I'm close to being free. And for the first time in my life, darling, white folks is looking up to me. Hear me, son, your daddy loves you. Keep hanging on to hope. My feet steady kicking the wind. Gotta help your mama being free. Daddy won't be coming home in my life, darling. You see, I reached white folks. The end is looking up to me. Of my rope. Lynch Family Blues. I know a lot of you probably saw Amanda Gorman and the incredible poem that she read at the inauguration ceremony. I have had the good fortune of working in the system, for lack of a better way to put it, that produced Amanda Gorman. For years I've been taking high school students to annual youth poetry festival called Brave New Voices. Brave New Voices is a poetry slam, poetry competition where high school teams of 4 to 6 students compete with their original spoken word pieces. And out of that whole movement, an organization called Urban Word in New York thought that it would be very cool to have a youth poet laureate. And so that's how all of that started. And it was just incredible to see her step into that moment. And just it validated to me the importance of teaching young people poetry. It's just such an incredible way to address issues of social justice and to capture the spirit of a moment like her poem did that day. But then there are times where it doesn't always work. Like I've had some misses in my career. I do a lot of work, or at least at one point had done a lot of work with incarcerated youth. I would do a lot of poetry workshops in detention centers. And one summer, working with the Arts Council, we came up with this idea for a program called Sentence to the Arts. And we would get incarcerated and adjudicated young people to do community-based art projects over the course of the summer, and it would take time off of their sentence or off of their probation. And so I just came in with this mindset of I was really going to transform the lives of these young men with poetry, and it just did not work out that way. Over the course of the summer, as I got to learn more about them, their parents, or lack thereof, a lot of them, didn't have fathers in the home. It was just really bad. They were up against obstacles that, I never had to face as a young person. And so I learned a lot that summer, and I don't know that I successfully reached that particular group of young men, and because it bothered me, I decided to write a poem about it, and it is called The Prodigal Poem. This poem is unwanted. This poem is illegitimate. This poem was an accident. I didn't mean to write it. Yes, I let my pen touch the pad, but I was just scribbling, just doodling, just playing around with it like so many other poets before me. See, I thought the paper was on the peel, so I didn't use any protection. No correction tape is unwanted. No, this poem is illegitimate. This poem was an accident. I wanted to have it aborted, but by the time I let my pen touch the pad, but I was just scribbling, just doodling. The paper like some consent to an ink test, so I'm not claiming the paper was on. However, I see it hanging out in the hood sometimes. This poem lets its word sag so you can see it's behind. This poem wasn't raised right. It can barely even rhyme. This poem hangs out with weed papers and it drinks too much wine. This poem will be dead before it reaches its 21st line, crumpled up in some wastebasket next to a suicide letter, or tragically executed by a heartless paper shredder. At the very least, it will end up wasn't raised right. It can barely even rhyme. This poem hangs too late then to blame it on a dad whoever. This poem won't end happily. It's already lost touch with reality, heavily influenced by up in some ways, some warped hip-hop suicide letter, or tragically the genre to which it belongs. This poem thinks that it's a rap song. This poem wasn't raised right because it is. This poem hangs too late then to blame it on a dad whoever. This poem won't end happily. This poem will never be published, revised, or anthologized. This poem will never reside to a suicide letter or shelf. This genre to which it belongs. This poem thinks that it's a rap song. This wasn't raised. Could never be a real love poem. It's too busy trying to be a Mac Daddy. Countless careless encounters have made it a "that's just my baby's daddy" poem. And it has left fatherless verses in journals and notebooks all over town. With each passing line, it sinks further down. Now, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and not just these, but Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon yearned for this poem to follow them. These prophetic poems that foretold of the coming Messiah and the New Jerusalem reached out to this poem, prayed for this poem, loved this poem. But some poems just don't want to be saved. They just crash and burn at the bottom of the page. All right. So I had to write a poem once in response to a painting of a guy named Doc Brown, who was a legend in Kansas City back in the 1800s. I was doing this as a commission for the Kansas City Museum, and I was a little reluctant because Doc Brown was kind of in that kind of step and fetch it kind of stance, and he had his hat cocked, and I don't know, it felt problematic to me at first. But then when I learned more about him and the history of cakewalking, which was a dance that enslaved people did that mimicked white people in high society, it poked fun of them, like it was a subversive way for them to enjoy themselves and to kind of have this hidden meaning, this subtext. And so he was a master at it. He was written up in the Kansas City Star in the late 1800s, and if you know anything about the Kansas City Star, they have a racist history that they even began to own up to. But anyway, they didn't even report the deaths of black people in the obituary section in the Kansas City Star at that time. So for Doc Brown to have an article in that paper showed how much he was revered. And so I wrote this poem, and it's dedicated to Doc Brown. It's called "Why Black Folks Like to Dance." It opens with a quote from Ralph Ellison, who said, "For the art, the blues, the spirituals, the jazz, the dance was what we had in place of freedom. You study the darkness of my body, desiring to know the curve and the line. Whips scarred my back but never broke my spine. You implement strategies designed to steal what's inherently mine. You want to move like me, to groove like me, to boogaloo like me, but your body can't move like mine because it never needed to. I cakewalked out your slavery and you couldn't lynch my blues. You even try to dance like me, but you stuck with two left shoes. My hips undulate with a passion that shakes pine cones loose. My frame contorts in ways that Sherlock could not deduce. With every oppressor I face and throughout every abuse, my movements possess a beauty only struggle could produce. I keep it moving with the quickness, with the panther's agility, got a Lindy hop too fast for the naked eye to see. I call my left leg Malcolm and Martin is my right. I can march the streets of Birmingham at noontime and dance all Saturday night. Never understood how you could love my music, my walk, my talk, my style, but hate me so intensely. Why am I so reviled? May not ever get the answers on this side of eternity, but one thing is for certain, I'm gonna keep on doing me. I'm gonna dance like there's no tomorrow and sing at the top of my lungs. It ain't no use in fighting when I've already won. My black folks like to dance. Black folks can dance really well. I know it's a stereotype, but we do dance very well. Doc Brown was great at it. All right. And just a quick mention, I don't want anybody to feel like I'm trying to be accusatory or pointing the finger at anybody in particular. You know, I understand that there is a system in place that has caused a lot of these things to happen, and that's what I'm addressing. And I'm hoping that if you are a white person and you're in the audience, that you are getting a window into the black experience. I think that we have to learn more about each other if we're ever going to really achieve equity. And so hopefully you take it in that spirit, because as I said, it's just not my intention to ever offend anyone, unless they deserve it. All right. So yeah, I would like to share a poem now. As Amy said, I am the poet laureate of the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District. Just a brief bit of Kansas City history here. In the 1920s, Kansas City began to become an epicenter for jazz music. There was this guy, Tom Pendergast, Boss Tom, who ran Kansas City for all intents and purposes. His family owned a bar, and that bar was a meeting place for a lot of politicians and also a lot of mafiosos. So Tom Pendergast had strong political connections and strong connections with organized crime. So when Prohibition went into effect, because he had a liquor distribution company and owned a bar, he created Kansas City into what was known as a wild for selling liquor in Kansas City. By the time the 30s rolled around, because it had become such a great city to open up a jazz club, there were over 200 different jazz clubs in the Kansas City area. There was a whole lot that was going on that shouldn't have been, a lot of drugs, a lot of prostitution. Some people even say that Kansas City was one of the cities that kind of gave Bugsy Siegel the idea for Las Vegas, a place where you know, you could just not have to deal with the system of law at all. But Kansas City was very wild back in those days. But the great thing is the jazz music was evolving, and all of the greats traveled through Kansas City. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Charlie Parker, who was arguably the greatest jazz musician who ever lived, grew up in that neighborhood. So in '97, I was hosting a poetry reading in the 18th and Vine area because they had been talking about revitalizing that area. So historically, it was the segregated part of town where all the black people lived. That's where all of the black businesses were. And really, that community was thriving. But after integration, I would say by the time the 60s, 70s rolled around, that area had kind of fallen into disrepair. And so in the 90s, they said, you know what, we need to bring 18th and Vine back online. And I was just really excited about the energy and the excitement and started hosting this poetry reading. And then eventually got hired at the Jazz Museum, which opened there in '97. as the poet in residence. And so this is a poem I wrote way back then, just kind of trying to capture the excitement that we wanted to bring back to that part of town. And this poem is called Revival. There is a place where parched lips kiss warped reeds and cramped fingers stroke strings and keys, filling the air with melodies, and resurrected rhapsodies capture the cadence of ancient chants where shackles are removed and our ancestors dance in anticipation of liberty. And every note that's played is dedicated to their memory. There is a place where each heartache and every sharp pain can be soothed and smoothed by medicinal refrain. The story of King David makes it plain. And it came to pass when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul that David took a harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. You see, this divinely inspired requiem came forth from a glorious past, and although it defies description, we choose to call it jazz. And ever since this magical music emerged from space and time, it has found a permanent residence on 9+9 and Vine. Someday soon you'll travel there to escape from cell phones and emails and faxes, from being overworked and underpaid and paying too many taxes. This is the place where even struggle kicks off his shoes and relaxes, and the only war that will ever take place is the battle of the Saxes. This is the place where jazz is served up as a sensual delight, and it smells like grandmother's chitlins because she always cooks them just right, and it tastes like the peach cobbler she bakes that gets better with every bite. And it feels like love's very first kiss shared in the soft moonlight. And it looks like Susanna Jones when she wears that red dress. Lord, what a beautiful sight. And it sounds like the jazz disciples cool on a blue Monday night, or like Gabriel's trump at the rapture just before we take flight. So these ministers of music are awaiting your arrival, wanting to provide you with orchestral comfort as you witness the revival, because jazz, like matter, can't be destroyed. It only changes forms. And the historic intersection of 18th and Vine is where jazz will be reborn. Then we will cherish this noble noise and glow in the cool of its heat as the caramel-coated cacophony provides a sonically hypnotic beat that can only ever be heard through the tapping soles of the feet. And as willing slaves to the rhythm, our freedom will be complete. All right. So I also want to thank the people who may be watching via the live stream. Thank you so much. Appreciate feeling your energy here. So as I had mentioned, and let's see. Yeah, so I really like writing ekphrastic poetry that's inspired by art. So this is in person. This is Impressionist art section, but it's a painting of the eruption of Vesuvius by a 19th century painter named Sebastian Paether, and it's the light like that. It drew me. Like, they showed us all of these paintings. A friend and I got hired to do another commission and to find a painting in there that spoke to us, and that one just spoke to me. Also, Pompeii was kind of like, to me, very similar to America now. There was a lot of greed. There was a lot of conspicuous consumption. And that movie 79 AD talks about how, really the eruption of Vesuvius was like a divine curse or something. If you see the actual painting, there's like a couple of people that you can see here. And then, let me just ask somebody, what else do you notice about the painting? No wrong answers. Yes. Say it again now. Yeah, so it looks really calm over here, right? And then you got all this going on the right side. And so I was struck by that too. Not only the way he was able to capture light when you see it in person, but kind of this dichotomy, this end of the world kind of thing happening here and then this calm there. And then I also thought about the fact, as I said, that America, I think, has gotten to the place where we have gotten so caught up in materialism and consumption and all of those things that we just better be careful. I'll say it like that. And so the title of the poem is Break blow, burn, or self-portrait as the eruption of Vesuvius, or who would have thought it, how a 19th century English landscape painter inspired a 21st century black poet. Opens with two quotes, one from John 3:19, as this is the condemnation that light is come into the world and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. And then a stanza from Langston Hughes' poem, Negroes, sweet and gentle, soft and kind, beware the day they change their mind. Much like Pompeii, these are my last days. I lament and I praise as I encounter both aspects of me. I am a mercurial mixture of wrong and right. I am darkness, I am light. I am moonbeam sliding along the slick surface of a still lake. I am the quake and rumble of the earth's crust crumbling at its core, the release of fervent heat, the ooze of molten ore. Like tectonic plates, my impulses shifted rates that are massive. Just beneath my skin, there are cities buried in ashes, civilizations that couldn't hack it. I learned too late not to be too passive. I am empath, I am slow wrath, not quick to ignite, but possessing a curiosity for luminosity. I am drawn to the light, which is what brings me here tonight. This museum gallery, this sacred space filled with Pater's brilliance compels me to face that which wrestles inside of me, a dualism, a dichotomy. I am water, I am fire, I am content, yet I burn with desire. I am clear sky, I am clouds. I am the believer filled with doubts. I am a young man ensconced in age. I am a peaceful man consumed with rage. Like a still lake, I seem placid, some would even say flaccid, left in dismay when they are drenched in a cloudburst of sulfuric acid. So tired of just existing from day to day, so tired of looking the other way, tired of the burden of melanin, tired of the weight of the skin I'm in, tired of being told to be nonviolent when faced with aggression, tired of voter fraud prevention as an excuse for voter suppression, tired of folks not realizing the idea of race as an illusion, tired of politically empty words like diversity and inclusion, tired of make America great again encoded rhetoric with a supremacist subtext, tired of the proliferation of the prison industrial complex, tired of the media's machinations as truth subverters, tired of police brutality and state-sanctioned murder. So much like Vesuvius on this panel adorned in oil, I belch, I burst, I boil, I spit, I spout, I spew, I break, I blow, I burn, because I have learned I can no longer take it lying down with the system this corrupt. It's not enough to just erupt. You have to burn it to the ground. Okay. So we're going to 5:15. You guys doing okay? All right, couple more. I lost my set list. Hold on a second here. Okay. All right. So 2019 was the 400th anniversary of the first kidnapped Africans setting foot on American soil. And, you know, I was thinking about just what a enormous, Josh and I were talking about 12 years a slave, just how horribly brutal slavery was. And there are conversations now, about reparations and things like that. And I don't know if it'll ever gain any real traction. But one thing that I've come to understand, that it's not even just about slavery. When you look at it from 1619 to 1865, you have the most horrific system of chattel, horribly violent, racist slavery that ever existed. Then from roughly like 1865 to 1950, you had segregation, you had racial terror and the proliferation of lynching, you had redlining, you had unfair housing practices, you had all of these things, Jim Crow, that really kept black people from being able to realize the American dream. So in the 1950, I'll say to 1968, I say 1968 because of the assassination of Dr. King, but you got the civil rights movement, right? But during that time, all of these horrible assassinations, Dr. King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers. We just saw the movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, Fred Hampton. So, rounded off to 1970, and only since then have we had relative freedom, but from 1970 to now, you've got the rise of the prison industrial complex, the war on drugs, police brutality, and untold numbers. It's been happening all along. We just have the technology to record it now, and citizens can catch, officers in the act, but it's certainly not anything new. So that 400-year period has been pretty tough, you know what I mean? And so I was just kind of reflecting on that and thinking that it's a wonder, that Black people are still here. I mean, when you put all that together, those are just enormous obstacles to have to overcome. So the name of this poem is 400 Years Still Here, and it opens with a quote or a line from one of my favorite poets, Lucille Clifton, who said, "Won't you come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." Here is a 400-year-old poem, an elegy of sorts, because we sometimes use metrical compositions to make sense of death. Here is 1619. Here are 20 kidnapped Africans on a Dutch ship brought ashore to the British colony Jamestown, Virginia. Here is American history. Here are 20 souls beginning a history, a horror story with no end in sight. Here is how they stole the intangible. Here is your stolen language. Here is your stolen religion. Here is your stolen body. Here is your stolen mind. Here is where your family should be. Here is your wife. Here is your wife raped. Here is your wife raped while you stand aside and look. How do you write a rape poem? Here is your back. Here is your back bloody. Here is your back bloody and torn to shreds, ribbons of skin dropping to the dust. Here is your head, your body buried up to the neck. Here is your head atop your buried body being used for target practice. Here are 5 million stars over the Atlantic Ocean weeping. Here are 5 million Black bodies on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Here is the baby you had in the belly of a slave ship. Here is your baby tossed overboard because you'd rather see him in a grave than to let him be a slave. Here is a rusted knife. Here's a rusted knife on your genitals. Welcome to your castration. Here is where the pain begins. Here is where it never ends. Here's white Jesus. Here's white Jesus telling a lie that all will be glorious in the sweet by and by, that slavery is your destiny. Here is your wake-up call. Here is how you learn to stand tall. Here is your time to take up arms and fight for your freedom. Here is so-called emancipation. Here is birth of a nation. Here is how you survive. Here is June 19th, 1865. Here's your 40 acres and a mule. No, wait, my bad. There went your 40 acres and a mule. Here is your neck. Here is a noose. Here is a tree joined in the satanic trilogy. Here's your blood, here's your blood memory, here's your blood coursing through your veins, its memory contaminated on a cellular level. Here is winter in America, every government system whiter than snow. Here is slavery in a new context, here is the prison industrial complex, here is 4 centuries of dysfunction. Here and now is how you function, here is how you manage, here is how you cope, here is how you turn trauma into jazz, here is how you were built to last, here is how you ingest oppression, here is how you keep on progressing, here you are a miracle, fulfillment of the dream of your ancestors, and in spite of everything, you are still here. Okay. So I was talking to Josh. I know I keep saying that. We had like this 5-minute explosive conversation. It was great. And he was talking about teaching this class on Dr. King. And so I wasn't planning on reading this poem, but I thought I should. Back in 2013, I got a chance to work with jazz legend Bobby Watson on a commemorative recording. He wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And he wanted to kind of bring light to the fact that during that speech, we always hear like the last part, the I have a dream part, which is beautiful, eloquent, but it's really palatable, and it doesn't capture the full essence of what Dr. King was trying to communicate that day. in the opening portion of the speech, there are some things that he said that we're still struggling with today. You know, he talked about police brutality. He talked about reparations in a sense. And so with that in mind, Bobby decided to call the recording Check Cashing Day, right? Everybody looks forward to Check Cashing Day. But I wanted to just read a snippet of what Dr. King said in the speech. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but he said, in a sense, we have come here to our nation's capital to cash a check. He talks about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence being a promissory note. And then he said, instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. And so this is the poem that I wrote for the title track, Check Cashing Day. 210 years ago, Martin shared his dream for justice to roll down like a mighty stream, a dream rooted in reality and the solemn prospect that he had come to the nation's capital to cash a 100-year-old check. Like so many folks in the hood with bills stacked high enough for a bungee cord jump, anxiously looking forward to the first of the month with 300,000 black voices demanding their pay, August 28, 1963 was Check Cashing Day. And while America had sufficient currency in her bloated account and black folks were only requesting a fair amount like frogs playing basketball on a rubber court, the check still bounced. The first of the month has passed 600 times since Martin uttered those exalted lines, I have a dream. We hold that phrase in such high esteem, but there was another Martin who also dreamed. His name was Trayvon, and along with a bag of Skittles and a bottle of tea, his dreams were buried 6 feet deep. Slavery never really ended, it just changed forms, from sharecropping to wage restrictions to welfare moms. As Martin declared in reference to so-called emancipation in 1863, 150 years later, the Negro is still not free. A brother finally made it to the White House, but even a black president could not correct the problem of over 1 million black men in the prison industrial complex, or how, like so many autumn leaves, brown bodies piled up in city streets. Yes, the new Jim Crow has enormous wings and he loves to fly off with colored dreams, but back in '63, Martin also penned these lines, justice too long delayed is justice denied. And don't label me an angry black man, because believe you me, I understand when we follow the vision of Dr. King, white folks are full partners in the dream. But in our nation's attempt to fix the problem of race, you ain't never gonna fix what you can't face. So listen up, Uncle Sam, here we stand with this 150-year-old check in our tired black hands. There's nothing left to talk about, nothing left to say, but cough it up, America. It's check cashing day. We can do some Q&A now. You got 5 o'clock yet? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So we got about 15 minutes for Q&A if you guys have any questions. Don't all speak up at once. Yeah. So just my relationship to it, or like, because I want to make sure I answer your question. Is it kind of like what inspires me, maybe? Is that, or something different? When did I start? Okay, so when I was 8 years old, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. She babysat because both of my parents worked. And so she would always give me these great toys on my birthday, but on my 8th birthday, she gave me a copy of the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And that was it. So I was pretty salty. I was like, where are the toys? What's going on here? And so she challenged me to memorize it. And she said if I lived out the philosophy that was communicated in that poem, that I'd be a better person for it. The poem I won't share the whole thing, but it starts off, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, not give way to hating, and yet not look too good nor talk too wise. It goes on and on with all of these. It's kind of written from the perspective of a father to a son, and all of this great advice for how to live your life. And so, like I said, I was salty at first, but I love my grandmother, so I took on the challenge of memorizing it. It took me about 2 days, and I remember just being so proud when I was able to read it, to recite it to her. And about, a couple of weeks later, I started kind of writing my own poems, and I've been writing ever since. I lived in D.C. from 94 to 97, and that was the first time I got introduced to the term spoken word. Up to that point, I had just written poetry that was mainly to try to get girls, if I'm to be honest. I didn't really, have, it's just something that I like to do. But it wasn't like I saw myself necessarily as a poet at that point. So in D.C., I got introduced to spoken word, and there were all these venues around town where you could go and perform. And that's when I think I really got the bug, wanting to pursue it more seriously. So when I moved back to Kansas City, as I said, it was around 97, and they were talking about bringing the 18th and Vine area back online. So I found a little dive bar not far from, so we were on 19th Street, which was still kind of in the mix. And I started just hosting this poetry reading just because I enjoyed it and I had missed the scene I had been a part of in D.C. And then people began, I never thought I'd be working with young people, but people started asking me to work with kids. And so I had to start writing poems that had less profanity and, erotica and all of that kind of stuff, and move into kind of a different place so that I could relate to young people. And then it just slowly began to become a way to kind of communicate things about the Black experience. I have now been trying to write poems that come from a more personal place, not necessarily confessional, but I noticed that I'm addressing all of these topics and talking about all this stuff, and I think that the poetry is also about vulnerability. And so I would like to balance what I've been doing for, however many years with some things that are a little more, less confrontational, but still, anything that I write is going to come kind of from my experience, but just exploring other avenues of doing some introspection, because, when we talk about revolution, when we talk about change, that really has to come from within. And so that's what I've really been trying to challenge myself to do lately. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. So quick story. I went to Lincoln University in Jeff City, Missouri. It's a historically Black college, and historically Black colleges were really struggling at that time. A lot of them still are, but so the campus was primarily comprised of Black people, Black students, but the overall population of the university was largely white. A lot of white people who lived in the community would come and take classes, but they weren't a part of the culture of the university, if that makes any sense. And so there was this push at one point to turn Lincoln University into like an agricultural school. They were going to take away a lot of the scholarships from other programs and put it into this whole kind of agricultural thing, which they were trying to appeal to the rural area in which they lived, which would have then, where Lincoln University is located, which then would have just really kind of moved away from the mission of the school in the first place. It was established by former colored infantry men who had fought in the in the Civil War, and who had used their money to establish a place where Black people could get an education. And so I was working with the administration. I had been in student government, and I started to learn a lot of things about, just to me, some things that were not right, and I began to speak out against it. And then I began to learn more about like apartheid in South Africa and systemic racism and white supremacy. And I began giving these speeches like on a regular basis and organizing protests. And I was hanging out with some guys that were doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing, quite frankly. And the dean of students came to me and he said, you know what, I know who you hang around, I know what they've been doing. And if you continue down this path, I'm not going to say what he said because he used some really foul language, but he said, I will get you. And so I gave a speech. He had that conversation with me because we had Bishop Desmond Tutu's daughter, who her name was Naomi Tutu, and they wanted me to open for her, right? Like they felt like you give good speeches, you're good in front of an audience, but we want you to say what we want you to say. So he gave me that talk right before I went out to introduce Naomi Tutu, and I just blasted him. I just went all in, you know what I mean? And I got expelled and got in a lot of trouble with the law. It was all kind of set up, and I did not eventually have to go to jail, but it was a huge learning lesson for me in terms of, you know, when we talk about the civil rights movement, like Dr. King, they looked at that as a sacred kind of a thing. I mean, they would fast, they would pray. They were not just fighting in the flesh. They were coming at it from a spiritual perspective. And so at that time, although the facts were right, I was saying things that I knew to be true. I was associating with, you know, folks that were doing things that they had no business doing, and it was like guilt by association. And I'm saying all that to say that as I started taking poetry more seriously, I began to communicate a lot of the same truths that I was saying in those speeches, right? But for some reason, poetry and art, you know, you can state facts, you can give speeches and things like that. All of that is very necessary, but it's not until a person has like an emotional response to an issue that they really start to change their perspective or to want to do something about it. And so I found that the same truths that I spoke in those speeches that got me kicked out of school, draped in poetic language, have kept me out of jail and have afforded me opportunities to speak in front of audiences like this and not have people, you know, upset and hostile. Yeah. I know that was a long answer to a short question, but yeah. Yes.
If I could follow up on that, do you think that if you had opted to be a rapper, which you made a distinction there, if you had opted to be a rapper, that you would have the same reception?
Well, probably not, because I cannot rap. I love hip hop. Like, I remember, you know, 1979, the first time I heard Rappers Delight on the radio, and I was just totally, I knew something new was happening. You know what I mean? In terms of, it felt to me like that was the voice of my generation, right? And in the early days, you know, there were a lot of rappers who were communicating very positive messages and talking about, if not necessarily even a positive messages, it's kind of reporting on what was going on in urban areas, you know, all across the country. Had I been a rapper then, I don't know that I would have gotten into the same kind of trouble, because like when you're giving speeches and things like that, it's just a different context, you know what I mean? But even a lot of hip hop artists who are vocal about real issues don't get a lot of mainstream success sometimes. Some have been, you know, blackballed, and so there's a risk even with, you know, and I'm saying poetry is a good way and art is a good way, but, you know, there have been situations where it has not gone over well with the poems that I've read too. I'm just saying, I think that oftentimes you can say more in a poem or with art or in music than you can if you're just, you know, yelling at the top of your lungs. But we need all of it, don't get me wrong. But yeah, it's just what has worked for me. Yeah.
Considering the unrest, political economy, and protests,
Yeah, so a couple of things happened. I've written some poems during that window, but I want to work on them some more, before I share them, some revision. I'll say a couple of things about that. I think that we experienced that moment. It was like a perfect storm. Obviously, you had the pandemic, and I think that the pandemic, good, bad, or ugly, helped us to realize how connected we all are. I mean, we're talking about everybody on the planet is experiencing this horrible thing at the same time. Then we were forced, to stay at home. So we had to sit still. We couldn't get out. We couldn't be distracted. They cut off sports, which is a huge distraction. And so all of the protests and the violence and what we saw happening with Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, we were seeing it. We were, not that we hadn't seen it before, but without other ways of escaping it or avoiding it. I think that language is important. Obviously, I think that language helps to form thought. So I think over the past couple of years, the language has changed. So you do hear people referring to white supremacy, systemic racism. You hear like white privilege. And so if I go up to a white person and I say, hey, you're a racist, that white person 9 times out of 10 is going to say, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. But if you say you have privilege, right, that doesn't sound as offensive. And if that white person understands what privilege is and realizes that it is connected to a system of white supremacy and systemic racism, then I think it changes the perception, right? So the language had shifted, you got a pandemic, no distractions, we're all looking at this, and it just kind of blew up. But what I was heartened by was that there were so many white people on the front lines. A lot of my friends who were white were calling me, just kind of checking in and like, are you okay? Or what should I be doing? And, some of the conversations, quite frankly, were a little awkward. But to me, it demonstrated that there are people out there who don't look like me, who are also frustrated with the way the system is and who want to see change. And so I've written some poems in response to that, but they just need a little more work, I think, before I share them. But yeah, I think Nina Simone said an artist's job is to reflect the times. And so it's important to me to write about the things that are going on, that I'm experiencing, right? So that 100 years later, if God's willing and somebody reads a poem that I wrote, they get a real sense of what was happening, in 2020, 2021. Yes.
Okay, so I don't remember the local project, but you're talking about the Equal Justice Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
the local one is
So the local organization is the Community Remembrance Project. And so one's starting here, right? Right here in Atchison. So ours is the Community Remembrance Project of Missouri. They do it in all these different ways. Ours just happens to be a statewide one. I did bring some resources, not a whole bunch. When I got here, these are things that I just have in my car. It's not enough for everybody. I'd be happy to work with Amy to send more. But there's a calendar that's put out by the Equal Justice Initiative each year with great photographs. And each day of the year, there's some snippet of history. I'll be honest, most of it is dealing with the brutal side of racism. It's not a happy calendar, but it's incredibly informative. And then, so that's this. And then working with the Kansas City Public Library, I'm the director of Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center. Bruce R. Watkins was an incredible civic leader. Him and a guy named Leon Jordan, he was born in the 1920s. In 1962, him and this guy, Leon Jordan, started Freedom Incorporated, which was the first black political organization of its kind in the country. I was talking about Tom Pendergast and the political machine he had in Kansas City. Although he had gone to jail for tax evasion in the 40s, the vestiges of that political machine were still very active. Organized crime was still very much a part of the culture of Kansas City at that time. And so more often than not, it would be mafiosos. They would go into black communities, strong-arm them, and force them to vote for certain candidates, obviously candidates who didn't have their best interest at heart. So Freedom Incorporated was organized to develop, kind of galvanize the black community to vote for candidates that would have their best interest at heart, to develop people who had interest in political careers. Bruce R. Watkins became the first African-American to serve on the city council in Kansas City, the first African-American to run for mayor. Although he didn't win, he launched a very successful campaign. On the back cover is a picture of Bruce R. Watkins marching down I-70 with a group of high school students who were protesting after the assassination of Dr. King. But this book has biographies of several prominent African-American Kansas Cityans. And when we say Kansas City, you know, we got the two-state area, so we try to balance it between folks who are from Kansas City, Missouri, and on the Kansas side. And it's just a great resource. I brought them. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, they're here. I just thought, you know, with it being Black History Month, that might be something that you all would want to take note of. But what was I even answering the question to? The Community Remembrance Project and the Equal Justice Initiative. So yeah, the Equal Justice Initiative is the national organization that was started by Brian Stevenson. And so they focus on, they issued this national call for every, you know, county, city, state to study the history of lynching in their particular area. But at the same time, he has a cadre of lawyers who are working to get people who've been wrongly convicted, to find alternatives to the death penalty, to do all of these great things to you know, kind of change the justice system. They also started the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and it kind of looks at history from slavery. It's called, so the subtitle is Legacy Museum from Slavery to Mass Incarceration. So there's a museum that is focused on that history as well. Yeah.
So I do have a question.
That's okay.
My question, in your work, that actually was all very helpful, thank you. My question was, in your work with the Community Remembrance Project, like, if you could share with us something that has really surprised you in your work, and because it sounds like for many years you've already been, you know, learning about, very familiar with some of the injustices in Missouri, in the Kansas City area, but yeah, something, whether positive or negative or in between, but if you could share with us something that's really surprised you in your work with that project.
Yeah. So with all of the unrest and the protests that happened this summer, that historical marker for Levi Harrington that we had erected, and you all have seen historical markers, like, they're pretty substantial. Like, you know, this is steel, you know, the sign is about this big, but the pole that it stands on is steel, and it's about that thick. And so where that marker is in that park in Kansas City is kind of like an overlook, and that's where a lot of the people gathered to watch the lynching because he was hanging off of a bridge. And so we didn't want to put the marker under the bridge, so we thought putting it in that vantage point was, you know, the best way to kind of recreate what had happened there. And somebody sawed it off at the base, tossed it over the cliff, and that surprised me because, you know, graffiti, I kind of get it, but that's really, like, whoever did it had to bring, like, really serious tools and take some time. That was not like a 5-minute thing that happened, and so that surprised me that somebody would do that. Then we approached the police because some people were in the park that night, and there was a couple of things that popped up on social media, and they didn't take it seriously. You know, they were like, you know, just silly kid stuff. And we were talking about the fact, like, there was a Frederick Douglass Memorial, I forget in which city in New York, but the people who were responsible for that memorial got it classified as a hate crime. Then in Kansas City, there's a statue of Andrew Jackson downtown, where a lot of the protests were taking place in Kansas City, a couple of people spray painted that statue, and they found those guys the next day. You know what I mean? So that surprised me. Yeah.
And what did Andrew Jackson ever have to do with Kansas City?
That's a good question. I don't. That's a part of Kansas City history that I don't know. And I live in Jackson County, quite frankly. I don't know. I know that this is what I just always kind of assumed and never did the homework. Was, you know, Missouri was a slave state, and was for the Confederacy and all of that. So whoever kind of was in that, you know, slave owners and things like that were not problematic for Missourians to celebrate. Yeah. But that's a good question. Going once? Okay, yeah.
So thank you for coming today. Really do appreciate it.
Sure.
I thoroughly enjoyed your work. And I'm just curious how we can get and see more. Where can we find you?
Oh, gosh. Just check with Amy. She knows what I do. I have to do a much better job of kind of promoting myself, I guess you could say. But Facebook is Glenn North. That is the one social media platform that I feel fairly comfortable with. And when I say comfortable, I'm just talking about my proficiency with technology. I'm just not great at it. My website is glennnorthpoetry.com, and I've been trying to keep that updated a little bit better. But I'm very grassroots, very just kind of go with the flow, and friends and colleagues have really been urging me to, you know, do a better job of letting people know what I have going on and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you have any published collections?
Just the City of Song book. Yes, it's really more like a chapbook, but I'm working on my second collection as we speak. Yep. All right. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Glenn has agreed to stick around for a little bit. If you do have some questions that maybe you didn't want to ask in front of everybody, that you'd like to ask him, and then if anybody wants to come up and help us out with any of the materials that he brought, please feel free to do that. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciated you being here. Thank you so much. You too.